On November 21st, 1997, Nintendo of America filed a lawsuit in federal court against Hong Kong-based Bung Enterprises Limited. According to the lawsuit, Nintendo argued that Bung had willfully and directly infringed Nintendo's copyrights and trademarks with the sale of a device known as the Doctor V64, a backup device used to play Nintendo 64 games illegally, and they were seeking damages and an immediate injunction to stop the manufacture and distribution of the product. Nintendo also argued that the sale of any device that circumvented the Nintendo 64 security measures was illegal. The courts agreed and granted Nintendo's motion, and Bung was ordered to cease all sales of the Doctor V64. Nintendo was also awarded $7 million in damages. Yet the Doctor V64 has made its way into some well-known development houses such as Acclaim, one of the largest third-party developers on the Nintendo 64 at the time, who used the product as an unofficial DevKit on Turok 3 and others. So how did this come to be? In 1994, Bung Enterprises was formed by Thomas Magnautis and was focused on building electronic devices that would allow game systems on cartridge to be backed up. Of course, another way to say this is that these were piracy tools. Once you had a ROM, then you didn't need the original to play. Bung developed many backup devices, including the Game Doctor for the Super Famicom and the GB Exchanger, which used flash chips to back up Game Boy games onto. Bung was mostly unknown to North America, but when the popular online store Licksang.com began to sell Bung products, Nintendo became aware of the company. By the time the Nintendo 64 was released, Nintendo was well aware of disc copies that were used to flood the market, especially on the Super NES, and they took further steps to boost security. The Nintendo 64 used a CIC lockout chip, just like the Super NES and NES before it, but this time, the algorithm was much more advanced and the CIC chip worked in conjunction with the Peripheral Interface, or PIF as it's known, and this was much more complex to circumvent. It also became quickly apparent that floppy disk copiers would become obsolete. In general, Nintendo 64 ROMs are much larger than the Super Nintendo counterparts, and even the smallest N64 ROM would span multiple discs. But the saying goes, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Both developers and the public wanted the Nintendo 64 to use CD-ROM format. When it was clear that Nintendo was going to stay with cartridges, it wasn't received well. Popular RPG developer on the Super Nintendo, Squaresoft, cancelled all development on the Nintendo 64 and moved their efforts to the Sony PlayStation and took advantage of the CD-ROM format, where they would develop one of the best video games ever made, Final Fantasy VII. The PlayStation had CD-ROM, video CD, and audio CD. The Nintendo 64 had none of these. So electronics manufacturers in Taiwan and Hong Kong, including Bung, who were well established by now, began building CD-ROM based backup devices that utilized the EXT expansion port found underneath the Nintendo 64. This port was only ever used for one thing, the 64DD expansion, but was reverse engineered and discovered that the bottom expansion port has the same connectors as the cartridge port. This meant that a third-party add-on could be developed with a custom BIOS to use a CD-ROM drive to boot games from, but keep the cartridge port free for other things. It also meant with an original cartridge, it could be used to circumvent the lockout security check, as the Nintendo 64 would think that an official game was connected. This would become the CD-ROM drive that the Nintendo 64 never officially received. So I finally got my hands on a Doctor V64. This was a piece of hardware that I've wanted to get for my collection for a while. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what this device actually does and how it operates. Bung Enterprises released the Doctor V64 originally in 1997 at the cost of $450 US. On face value, that is quite expensive, but it has many features that justify the cost. The Doctor V64 plugs into the Nintendo 64's external connector and comes with an IDE CD drive. Initial units came with an 8-speed drive, but later models incorporated 16 and 32-speed CD drives. The heart of the V64 is the MOS Technologies 6502 CPU and a custom BIOS. The 6502 is a popular 8-bit CPU that was used in many computers and consoles such as the Atari 800, Commodore VIC-20 and Nintendo Entertainment System. The V64 contains its own memory. Initially came with 128 megabit or 16 megabytes of RAM, but this was increased to 256 megabit or 32 megabytes as the size of the games on cartridge began to increase. Although the Doctor V64 is a Nintendo 64 backup device, it also can be used as an external video CD player. And this was one of the ways Bung Enterprises managed to get this product through customs and in North America even after their court case with Nintendo. They simply rebranded and in some cases just concealed the fact that this product was a backup device for the Nintendo 64. But the system came with a CD-ROM full of Nintendo 64 ROMs, which was certainly one of the areas of concern for Nintendo. You'd simply turn on the Doctor V64, navigate to the ROM that you wanted to load, and it would load itself into the Doctor V64's main memory. But in order to play backup software, the Doctor V64 came with an adapter that you would connect into the cartridge port and you would plug in any cartridge from any region. This was used as a donor cartridge and utilized the CIC lockout chip in order to bypass the security check. Once the game had completely loaded from CD into the Doctor V64's main memory, turning on the Nintendo 64 would treat the Doctor V64 like it was just another cartridge that was plugged in. The Doctor V64 would also allow you to dump the contents of a cartridge to a ROM. Incidentally, if you've ever downloaded a Nintendo 64 ROM and seen the extension .v64, it's originally come from the Doctor V64, as that was the file extension the device used for its ROM dumps. Dumping a cartridge is stored in the Doctor V64's main memory, and of course this is volatile, and as soon as you turn off the system the contents are lost. But there was another way to dump games and retain them, and that's to use a PC. One of the features of the Doctor V64 is its ability to transfer files, allowing you to send any contents of the DRAM to a PC, so you could make ROM dumps of any cartridge. You could also use this feature to dump the BIOS. As well as this, you could upload a new updated BIOS to the Doctor V64. So let's be clear, the Bung Enterprises Doctor V64 is a piracy tool. It allows you to dump ROMs from cartridge, burn them onto a CD. You can have a CD full of Nintendo 64 ROMs and then load those ROMs back onto the Nintendo 64 without needing the original game. I mean, that is a piracy tool in anyone's book. But where it gets interesting is on the back of the Bung Doctor V64 is a parallel port connector, and interfacing into a PC would allow the Bung Doctor V64 to turn itself into a fully fledged Nintendo 64 development kit. With a Windows PC, parallel cable and a Nintendo 64 MIPS cross compiler, by plugging one end into the PC and the other into the Doctor V64 meant that you could write code on your PC, then push it to the Nintendo 64 and test. This meant that the Doctor V64 could be used as a development kit. By simply leaving the transfer program enabled on the Doctor 64, you could transmit new data over the wire, test and debug quickly. Although you couldn't do some advanced stuff like remote debugging, use of debug symbols and breakpoints, it worked well enough. And for $450 all of a sudden became a very attractive proposition for development studios working on Nintendo 64 games. And the Doctor V64 was more than capable as a development kit. Even Bung would frequent Nintendo 64 Usenet groups to advertise the Doctor V64 as a development kit and attempt to undercut Nintendo. Why pay Nintendo $3,000 to $4,000 more for the development kit that does about the same thing? Equip 10 or more programmers playtesters for the price of one Nintendo SDK. Imagine saving $30,000 to $40,000 in development costs in one shot, they proclaimed. Acclaim Studios in Austin, the same development studio who worked on the Turok line of games, used Doctor V64s in their office during the development and testing of Turok 3. But the timeline here is important. Turok 3 was released in August of 2000 for the Nintendo 64 in North America. Nintendo won its court case against Bung in 1999. So how does Acclaim Studios end up using illegal backup devices as dev kits? Quite simply, cost. A Nintendo 64 partner development kit was very expensive to purchase. Even though Acclaim had millions of dollars in the bank, it made more sense to them just to buy a $450 alternative and provide them to all developers and testers in the studio. It's not entirely clear if they used the Doctor V64 on any other projects, but they certainly had them and they used them on the Turok 3 project. Bung Enterprises themselves also wanted to promote the Doctor V64 for homebrew development. A demo competition known as Presence of Mind or POM was set up in 1998 with Bung as the major sponsor and supplied Doctor V64s as prizes. The contest also occurred in 1999, and there were some very clever and innovative demos that came out of this particular demo competition. After Nintendo won its court case, Bung ceased selling their products, but not before they tried to rebrand and try a few shady tricks to keep selling their products in North America. 4 days after Bung announced they were closing down operations, they returned as First Union Limited. Initially, Bung denied that they were connected. First Union supposedly had products that were compatible with Bung, but in reality was the same company, trying to fill outstanding Bung orders. It's also worth noting that the Doctor V64 was released in 1997, before the first ever Nintendo 64 emulators were released on the PC. Back then, no one was emulating the N64, so unless you owned original Nintendo hardware and a way to load ROMs, there was not much you could do with the ROMs themselves. Of course, these days, all this is replaced by one of these, an EverDrive cartridge. And while it's easy to forget about the Doctor V64, its unique set of features meant that it was so much more than just another tool for piracy. So there you have it, guys. That's the story of the Bung Enterprises Doctor V64. It's an interesting story to go back and revisit. Obviously, this hardware was used for piracy first and foremost. I mean, you could load Nintendo 64 ROMs off a CD that came supplied with the hardware itself. So I mean, this was a piracy tool first and foremost, no question about it. Yet somehow it ended up being a development kit for major development studios in North America like Acclaim for the development of games like Turok 3. So how does that happen? And I think at the end of the day, that Acclaim and other studios saw the cost benefit of a $450 development kit versus the tens of thousands of dollars that you'd have to spend on official Nintendo 64 development hardware back at the time, and really just, leverage the cost savings that they were able to get from these types of things and utilize the Bung Doctor V64s for the development of Turok 3. I mean, 10 of these would cost you $4,500, and you could purchase one for every developer in your dev studio, and essentially it would do the same thing as the kind of high-end Nintendo 64 development hardware that was around at the same time. So it was a no-brainer at the time to utilize hardware like this in order to do your development on. Well guys, I'm going to leave it here for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. If you liked this video, you know what to do. Leave me a thumbs up. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.